All right. I'm here with Brandon Smith and my dog. And I've known Brandon for a couple of years now, and I wanted to get his opinion on the California fires that are going on right now, and I wanted to pick his brain a little bit. And I figured I'd record it so more people can learn from what he has to say. The date is January 11th, 2025, and the LA is on fire right now. And so, yeah, I was hoping Brandon could fill me in a little bit on what on what's happening. Now, Brandon, you are a firefighter, correct?
Uh, yes, so I've spent the last 2 summers doing wildland firefighting in northern Nevada, and I've done suppression tactics and prevention tactics in like Colorado, Nevada, Washington State, Arizona. I burned I did prescribed burning for about 100,000 acres when I went up to Alaska the summer before last. So I've and Montana. I've been lucky to get a decent amount of experience. Prior to that, I did a season with AmeriCorps with their veterans fire crew at New River Gorge, and that was mostly prevention management for vegetation, but it's all kind of cumulative. Um, since then, I started a Master's of Natural Resources for Fire Ecology through University of Idaho, and I actually graduated in May. So
Congratulations.
thanks, I'm excited about it. I've also worked with the Nature Conservancy. I've done lots of prescribed burning with them and did some land stewardship, um, mostly like invasive species management, seed collection, stuff like that. Um, both ends of the suppression and the prevention tactics for fire.
Okay. That's some experience you got there. How'd you get into this? Was this like a volunteer basis?
So actually, I worked at Memorial Park, the park here in Houston. It's one of the biggest in Houston, and honestly, I love Memorial Park. It's one of my favorite parks. Um, and I was their trail specialist for a few months there. And one of the guys in the arbory department did wildland firefighting before. Um, I wasn't really sure what path I kind of wanted to take. I just finished my undergrad from the University of Houston Clear Lake in business and a minor in anthropology, but that wasn't really what I wanted to pursue. But we had talked a lot about fire and um, basically the benefits, the environmental benefits and impacts of fire. And being in Texas, I was one of like many of us that didn't really know much about fire. Um, to me, it was more you only see it as destructive. And that's really like the only education that we had on it. So I was laid off from that position at the park, and I got an email from the VA for this veterans fire crew. And I actually had applied for the one in Tennessee, and one of the um, one of the directors for the Appalachian Conservation Corps in West Virginia gave me a call, and she's like, "Hey, I saw that you put in your resume for Tennessee, but we have this one that we're starting in New River Gorge. It had just become a national park about a year prior, and so we were one of the first ones we were the first ones to start this veterans fire crew in New River Gorge, and so that was a really cool experience. Um, I had considered the thought of doing wildland fire and doing fire ecology, but I hadn't really decided on it yet. But basically from there, it kind of I knew that that's kind of what I wanted to do, and I understood like basically the prevention and the suppression and like all the different variables that go into fire um, and those aspects.
What is it about the firefighting aspect that drew you to it?
Um, so when I was in the army, one of the things that I came to realize was the the officers that I had that were in charge, typically the best officers that knew how to lead and were good and efficient and that were trusted, they had been prior enlisted. So they knew the inner workings of that machine. And so knowing that I wanted to do fire ecology, I knew that I would want those types of like the foundational, like the knowledge, firsthand fire behavior, fire patterns for whether it's grass or shrubs or trees. I wanted that knowledge because it's not really something that you can learn or implement in academia. And I know that more now than I did then, but the reason that I did it then is because I figured that that would be beneficial for me.
Interesting. So, you're talking about whether it's grass or shrubbery or whatever it is. What exactly makes that LA area so unique in terms of fire and
So
how it spreads?
they have a lot of chaparral, which is it's a shrub, but it's kind of it's what we call volatile, and that's kind of a contentious term in the fire ecology world because
Why is
volatile can
that?
mean a bunch of different things.
Okay.
But in this way, it's whenever it burns very hot, and it's kind of like our Yopon holly. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Yopon holly, but Yopon holly is native to here, just like their chaparral is native to there. But if it becomes too big and it's not managed properly, then the fire becomes much more intense and much more severe. And so you have a fire that potentially is 3 to 5 feet tall. And if it's not managed, you have a plant that's maybe 5 to 8 feet tall. I don't know offhand how tall chaparral gets.
So
Um,
chaparral, just for my knowledge, that is the species of plant or is like a class of plant?
no, it's a species of plant.
Okay.
And I can send you more information on that. I'd have to look it up to give you some more. I'm more knowledgeable on our local, like our shrubs, our grasses, our forbs, our trees, stuff like that. And I've kind of ventured a little bit more into theirs, but chaparral is more local to like the West Coast. And whenever I was in Nevada, we dealt a lot more with like sagebrush and juniper. So it's kind of similar, but it's a little bit different.
Okay. Okay. So when you said that it's volatile, does that is that standard for that species or is it just like the environment? It's like I know they had a drought. Uh,
So I can actually show you a video of so this is going to be Yopon holly, and it's another species that we consider to be volatile. We have several, and it's basically the the plant chemistry, like the tannins that are in for Yopon specifically, the tannins make it more flammable, even though the plant has a higher fuel moisture. It's like building a fire. So you don't want to find a stick that is more green or has more fuel moisture in it. You want to find one that's dried out because it's going to burn easier. And so with Yopon Holly, it catches easier and faster because of the chemicals that are produced by it. And that's the same with like the chaparral and like the evergreens and things like that. They're really receptive. We call them fire receptive. They're really receptive to fire, even though they hold a lot more moisture. But in that same aspect, they burn out a little bit faster. And I can show you a video of a Yopon holly burning that kind of gives you a good example of how the fire is supposed to be versus what the fire does whenever it's burning.
now, why don't you share your screen and we can take a look at it? Do you have it pulled up right now?
Yes.
Let's see it. So chaparral, that is their local plant that is, would you say it's causing the fires or that's what's causing it to spread? So,
No,
rapidly?
that's what causes it to spread. And I think once I show this video, it might give you a little bit better idea of what I'm trying to say. So this is some prescribed burning that I did with the Nature Conservancy in Silsbee at the Sandylands um, uh, restoration. I don't remember the name of it, but it's a Nature Conservancy owned location, and they do a lot of loblolly and longleaf pine restoration and management. And so this Yopon right here is burning, but it's supposed to be between 1 to 3 feet. And so this is about 7 years of growth. And so you can see these taller trees, these are like the pine trees. And those actually need fire um, to grow, to reproduce.
What
Um,
do you mean by that?
I can get into that. Let me show you this video really quick.
Okay. Oh, wow.
So at
That
the
was just
end,
incinerated.
yeah, so see how at the end right here, that
Hmm.
fire is only like 1 to 2 feet? That's pretty typical for what fire should be for like a like our ecoregion. We're a coastal prairie ecoregion, and so we should have a lot more grasses. We do have trees because we butt up to like going into Brenham and that area. You have a um, post oak savanna. I'm sorry, I blanked for a second. Post oak savanna. And so we should have a bunch of oaks and maples and elms. And then north of us, we have like in the this area, we have piney woods. And so we should also have a bunch of like loblolly pine and longleaf pine, things like that. So this is all kind of native to our area, but for the most part, we should have more grass. I'm not sure what the ecoregion for where the Palisades fire is, but where they're at, they're probably more of a um, like a prairie as well, like a shrub grass prairie. I'd have to look that up as well. But so here we have about 1 to 2 feet of flames. And that's basically what we should have. But you saw whenever it actually did ignite, it kind of went up really, really fast. And the fire around it was a lot more intense and a lot more severe. Does that make sense?
Yes. So are you saying that if there was more grass there, it wouldn't spread as quickly?
I'm saying that so with the Palisades fire, relating it to this fire, if you have this flame with this fuel, anything that burns is fuel. So with this fuel that's only 7 years old, if it's been not managed for longer, you're going to have a much bigger flame. So this
What does that
grass,
mean to be managed?
we call it managed or treated. Mode or like if you've seen controlled burns or like I think the Arboretum had goats at their location a few years ago, and so the goats will go in and like eat some of the grass. It's getting rid of the understory so that this and this doesn't catch up here. And it kind of
Okay.
depends on the location of what you're wanting to manage, which is what this whole thing is, because a lot of our areas need to be managed because they haven't been. Um, so the grass catches this on fire because grass it spreads a lot faster, and this, depending on how tall it is, how dry the fuel is, it catches up higher, and then that's whenever you start to get crown fires or canopy fires, which you obviously don't want. And so that's
So
that's kind of the difference.
who's primarily in charge of doing that kind of management? Is that the government or is it private companies? How does it work here in Texas, anyways?
In Texas, we don't have a lot here. Not until you get further north, like Lubbock, Amarillo. I don't know if you remember um, the the smokehouse fire. that happened, excuse me, in Amarillo earlier this year or earlier last year. Um,
I don't recall.
it's now the largest fire in Texas history. It was 1.3 million acres, and that was mostly grass, but that I think was more county. And basically, it's kind of like a fire department because our fire departments also have wildland firefighters in them. And so they'll get a call of fire, and then whoever responds first kind of takes priority, um, because they also have like the private CAL FIRE people there. So it really depends on what the circumstances are. If it were a controlled burn, like the Forest Service or the Bureau of Land Management were conducting a controlled burn and it escaped, then they would be the ones to operate it.
Okay. Okay. So, what do you know about the Palisades fire that the average person wouldn't know just looking at it? Because I'm only seeing what I see on the news. Uh,
So with that, you kind of have to go back into um, the history of, we can stop sharing the screen now, into the history of like fire ecology and fire management. Um, because in the fire ecology timeline, it's pre and post colonization. The natives used prescribed or controlled burns for lots of things, putting nutrients back into the ground, managing the understory, like the invasive species. Sometimes they use them to herd animals. They're very heavily dependent on fire because they knew that regardless of human activity, fire exists, whether we're here or not.
like,
And
are you
actually,
talking about pre-18th century kind of
yeah,
times?
yeah,
Okay.
basically before we came over.
Okay.
Um, and one of the things that I learned in school that I didn't actually know was that the chemical equation for combustion, which is fire, is the reverse equation for photosynthesis. So a plant that's
Huh.
burned is a plant that's basically completed its cycle. And so those nutrients, the carbon, the nitrogen, the oxygen, that goes back into the ground. And that's why you have a burst of growth after a controlled burn.
That's super interesting. Can you go into a little more detail about that on like the formula for combustion versus photosynthesis?
Yeah, actually, I'd have to look that up, but there's a really good, um, let me see if I can find it. Um,
Because photosynthesis, you're taking light and turning it into energy, and then
yep.
are, does that are you taking energy and turning it into light with combustion? Light and heat, I guess.
Okay. We can share the screen. Okay, so with this, you have six CO2 to six H2O, which is water, converts with light to sugar, and then oxygen. The reverse, which is combustion or fire, takes the oxygen and the sugars that burn, uses that heat, and returns it to water and carbon dioxide. It's a lot more
Hmm.
complicated than that because you also have, like with the chaparral or the Yopon holly, you have um, basically like ineffective or like the efficacy of burning. So like soot and ash and smoke, that's all dependent on what you're burning, and that's just the aftermath of how efficient that plant burned. And so that's why when you
Okay,
see
so
white smoke or black smoke, they determine different things because that's what's burning.
would it be fair to say that that sugar is fuel?
Oh yeah, and that's why we call it fuel.
Okay.
Yeah,
Huh.
anything that burns, we call fuel. And that's why we also have like it's called WUI. It's an acronym. wildland urban interface, and that's what California, the Palisades, actually exists in, and that's anywhere that a fire could happen within, like somewhere that has houses or a population, because houses can burn. And so if you don't manage the fuel around your house or around your community, then it's going to burn.
Why then does a dead plant burn faster than a live plant?
So that goes back to the campfire thing, because it doesn't have as much moisture. And
Oh, yeah.
that's another, honestly, like I didn't know a lot of this before I started, but once you start getting into the specifics of it, it's very it's simple. But that doesn't mean easy, because it all exists within, like, this is dried out so it burns easier, or this has more moisture so it doesn't burn as easily. And there's obviously, like, within every part of that there's going to be more complexity, but for the most part it's air, fuel, and a spark, and that is what contributes to the fires.
So what, why is it in California that is it true that there's like four fires going on right now?
I think there's more than that. I saw earlier, because there's the Palisades fire, the Eaton fire, um, and then there's like two or three more that I saw. I'd have to look it up, but yeah. Um, and so once you get into like a crown fire or a canopy fire, you have the possibility of spot fires, which also,
Okay,
if you're looking
explain
at,
the difference between all three of those.
I'm going to, which, like, looking at the campfire scenario again, like, if say you move a log and then it starts to spark and then you see those embers blowing away, those embers, if they find like grass or fuel that's fire receptive, then that's going to start another fire. And so we call those spot fires.
Okay.
um, and so a canopy, like the canopy of the trees, which is basically the top of it, if you have a canopy fire, you have a lot more that's burning and a lot more potential, especially with winds that are 50 to 70 miles per hour with gusts. You have a lot more potential to throw those sparks and start more spot fires.
Interesting. But when it's at the canopy, if heat rises, how likely is it to catch find a spot?
So heat alone isn't going to catch it. You have what's called a flash point, and that is the temperature required to initiate combustion. And so, like a car, like, it puts out a spark and then it combusts and then it keeps going and it's cycling. Um, the heat alone isn't going to start that unless it's at a certain temperature, but you're not going to get that temperature unless you have like an ember, or like a lightning strike, or like someone throwing a cigarette butt out. And that's why you have like red flag warnings. You you try to limit the amount of potential for those fires to start. But then once they do start, if you haven't, it's like throwing a bunch of gas cans onto a pile next to a fire, like a campfire, and then hoping it doesn't ignite. It's not, it's not if it's going to ignite, it's when. And if you just keep throwing more gas cans, which in this scenario it would be not reducing some of that fuel load, then you're going to have a lot bigger of an explosion.
Okay. Okay. So, we've seen a bunch of reports come out about different forms of mismanagement in the Southern California area as far as the trees are concerned. Recently, I think it was like yesterday or the day before, they said they had a suspect for arson. Is an arsonist, to me, it seems unlikely that that would be the sole cause for one of these fires. What do you think as a professional?
I think, and kind of going back to the history of fire for the United States, um, it doesn't matter who or what started the fire. Because, like I said, fire exists without people. Like we have dry lightning or any other method that could start the fire. It's the lack of management and control over the fuel. And so you're inviting potentially, I mean, that's speculation. You're allowing the potential for an arsonist to start a fire. And with not managing that fuel, that's kind of um, allowing the potential for it to spread like it has. And so I mentioned the history of fire because one of the biggest things that honestly I didn't know about, and most people don't know about, is the Great Fire of 1910. Because after Gifford Pinchot and Teddy Roosevelt founded and started the Forest Service, the um, the propaganda known as Smokey Bear was no fires ever. We're only going to do suppression tactics. And so for about 10 or so years after they started the Forest Service, there was just a growth of, or they allowed the fuel to grow. And then there was a really bad storm near the Coeur d'Alene, southeastern Idaho, and lightning strikes. And like one of the worst lightning strikes they had just started a bunch of fires and it burned, I think, well over 3 million acres, the biggest fire in our country's history
Wow.
because we only did suppression tactics. And that's one of the things why suppression doesn't work. You can use it, um, but for the most part, you need to do like preventative stuff. And that's controlled burning or herbivory, which is like cows or sheep's eating the grass. Um, Mechanical treatment, which is like chainsaws, or like a skid steer, getting rid of some of the lower canopy or the understory brush, or even herbicide. Like there are a lot of different techniques, but fire is just one of the most efficient and effective because it's the most natural.
For herbivory, as you said, are would you suggest like introducing new species into that environment, or just like helping those species that are already there uh, procreate and
Species in terms of like plants or animals.
um, animals?
Um, I mean, that's honestly up to the person that's managing the land. Excuse me. I mean,
You
goats
mentioned
are,
goats earlier here in Houston. Is that like common?
it is actually. We don't do it as often as we should. But there's a lot of people that are trying to um manage because so I brought up the growth years. It took about 10 years to create that fire that started and burned about 3 million acres. And that growth that I showed you with the Yopon holly was about 7 years. Most of what we have in Texas is 50 to 100 years of growth.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So are we in trouble? Should we be concerned about this?
Um, I mean, yes and no. So one of the only reasons that we don't burn like California does is because we have a higher relative humidity and we have more frequent rain, which keeps higher fuel moisture content. But that's also why I kind of bring up the like the Yopon holly or like the dwarf palmetto, which are two very volatile species that once they ignite, if there's anything around it, like dead pine needles, or and actually I can show you some good examples of that as well, because
Please do.
that's one of the things that I did with my assignment for some of my classes. And so this is Yopon Holly, and I'm sure that you've seen it. You just don't know that you've seen it.
Hmm.
Yopon is supposed to be from like 1 to 3 feet tall. And most of the Yopon that we have is about 20 feet tall, which means it has become invasive and there's no room for other plants or grasses to grow.
Invasive from where? I'm assuming it says Chinese there. Is that from China?
Invasive doesn't mean non-native.
Oh, okay.
And
What
that's one
is
of the other things that a lot of people in Texas don't realize. A lot of people that I've talked to that are land stewards and that have done a lot of land management their entire lives in the state don't realize that this needs to be managed. So this is invasive and native. This is
okay?
invasive and non-native.
Explain to me the difference. Like, what does invasive mean then, if not
Invasive
native?
means that it's taking up resources necessary for another thing. And so with this Yopon holly, it's been allowed to grow to such a degree that the root systems branch really far down, and it doesn't allow the native like grasses to reproduce or to populate. And the same with this, but this is also invasive because it is very prolific. One of the examples
Meaning,
that we have in the Great Basin in Nevada is cheatgrass. Cheatgrass is incredibly prolific. It's non-native and it's invasive, and it is very, this goes into a different topic, but it is fire dependent, which also kind of goes back to the loblolly and the longleaf pines. We call them serotinous because those they need the fire to open up the pine cones and release the seeds. With the cheatgrass, it dries out faster, so it becomes a lot more fire receptive. Um, and the surrounding native plants, which are the sagebrush and the juniper, it wipes out the sagebrush because it typically it's like sporadic, like a bunch of like sagebrush and like maybe a juniper. And then so you might have like a lightning strike that strikes a tree, like a juniper tree, and then it just goes out. But now that you have all this cheatgrass that has made itself fire adaptive and fire dependent, it spreads, it wipes out the sagebrush to grow more cheatgrass. And then now, since the sagebrush is gone, the juniper is able to spread its roots, and then so you don't have any more sagebrush there. And so now, even though the juniper is native, it's becoming invasive because of the cheatgrass and the fire. So we're
interesting.
completely changing the ecoregion for the Great Basin based off of one non-native invasive species.
Okay. Okay. So so limiting the growth of that species is something that you would consider management, right? Okay.
Yeah, and
Now, I
so
remember, I'm sorry?
well, I was going to say, like the Yopon Holly, that's kind of the same thing. And part of the reason we have so much flooding here is because the native grasses, their root systems are between 10 and 20 feet long down into the earth. And so they suck up a lot of water. But if you aren't able to grow any of those grasses because of this, you're going to have a lot more flooding because of our loamy soil.
Oh, okay. So management of these areas can actually prevent some of the flooding we have here, huh?
Yep.
Okay. So going back to what we were talking about, management, and actually let's go back a second to when we were talking about suppression. One of the things I've been wondering is why is it so frowned upon to use salt water, like ocean water, to suppress these fires?
Um, Salt actually isn't all that great. Um, for short term, it sucks up a lot of the nutrients that the water has, And so it's not it damages the plants essentially. It's bad for the animals, it's bad for the plants. I mean, it's necessary for what we have now. Um, but also if we get to a point where we have to do this longer term, I actually was reading about this yesterday or the other day on um, the ecology subreddit because they were asking about the saltwater usage. Um, some rains will probably wash it away. But if we have to use it more long term, like if we have more fires like this in California or other areas, and we have to use the scoopers for ocean water, then it's going to be a lot worse for those nutrients because you already like if you have a fire that is that big, um, you're already destroying those nutrients anyway. So you're already creating a sterile soil that it just won't, it'll take a long time for plants to redevelop there. And then if you're throwing salt water on top of it, it's just not going to make it better.
Okay. So it's just going to make it harder for vegetation to grow. Would that
Yeah.
is that good for managing fire spreading,
The salt water?
or just like, you know, sterile soil? Is that better for
Um,
preventing fire spreading?
no, because if you have sterile soil, you don't have the plants there that prevent like soil erosion because the root systems, instead of being down in there and holding all the soil together, you have a lot more avalanches and mudslides and um, things like that because you don't have what's supposed to be there, what's adapted to grow there and prevent it from getting worse. Um, or you have like in the Great Basin where now you're changing this ecoregion where all that stuff is now better served for cheatgrass. And it's just kind of completely changing that landscape, um, which happens, but we're also kind of expediting that.
By when you say we're expediting it, you mean by using the salt water?
Um, No, not necessarily. Well, if we did use more salt water, then yes, because you have more, if you have more salt water, then you have more salt that seeps into the ground. And so it's gonna, I mean, take longer. Plant succession from like a sterile soil takes between like 500 to 1,000 years. So it's not really going to affect us. But if you have that over all these different areas, and then you keep increasing that over newer areas, then it's just making that worse. And so
Got
it's
it.
not necessarily that the salt water is making it bad or worse, it's that it's just not helping at all. But it's also kind of where we've gotten to at this point because we have so many different areas that just need so much management and treatment because we just like, and I'm definitely guilty of it too. Like you look outside and you see all the green, you're like, whoa, that's so beautiful. And now I look outside with the vision that I have, and I'm like, that's super stressful because that could go up and it would all be gone.
So I remember back in, I want to say it was like 2017-ish, there were forest fires in California then. And at the time, President Trump was like, oh, it's because they're not raking the leaves enough. But I thought that was a really silly thing to say. But, from what you're telling me now, maybe did he have a point there?
So he does have, to a certain degree, a point. Um, but it's not as simple as what he's making it sound. It's not, hey, let's go rake up the leaves. It's, hey, let's clear out the understory because it needs management. And
Is that the
that's where I think a lot of us need to understand that it's not really a political thing. Like you can turn it into a political thing, but it's all ecology. And I like to say that ecology is the philosophy of the sciences because every single thing, um, is interconnected. Like there have been plenty of things that I've kind of talked about today that's all kind of like interconnected, and one thing tips over another domino, tips over another domino. But that's just what ecology is. And the fact that we've made this so politicized is absurd because,
Just unscientific.
yeah.
Um, what all goes into management aside from, say, raking leaves or cutting the grass or
So, I mean, that is some of the biggest things. Like in the East Coast, we have a lot more leaf litter on the ground. And so that's like leaves that have fallen, that are dead, like oak or elm or maple or whatever, that have just like fallen on the ground. And so in wildland firefighting, you make what are called fire breaks. And that's where you're essentially cutting off the area between like burned parts or parts that could burn. And so that's what you see with like the planes that are dropping fire retardant lines, because you're trying to prevent the fire from continuing. And a lot of what we do for creating those fire breaks on the East Coast is using a blower, like a leaf blower, and creating a fire break because you're putting a barrier in between this pile of leaves that can burn and this pile of leaves that can burn.
what do they do with all that excess fuel once they remove it? Or what's the proper thing to do with it?
It depends on where you're located at. A lot of places will like so what we did when we were on the East Coast was more it's called lop and scatter, where you take the branches and you cut them up into pieces and then kind of scatter them around. Um, or we did wood chipping, or there's a lot of different variables that kind of go into that, like what type of um, fuel you have, what type of, excuse me, constant fuel moisture you have, what type of vegetation you have, um, what the um, like how big the trees are, because we like that's also getting into like we have 110, 100, and 1,000 hour fuels, and that's how long it takes for the dead fuel to dry out. So if you have a lot more grass, then you're not going to want to put like a whole bunch of um like stuff all over the place to catch and get bigger. You want like what we call jackpots, where it's like fuel that is like maybe 100-hour fuel that takes 100 hours to dry out. It's not going to burn that if it catches on a grass fire, because it's just going to go straight over it or around
As
it.
we as we start using more petroleum products, like a lot more plastic in our houses and whatnot, does that make it more difficult to manage these fires in places like LA where people's houses are catching fire quickly? Or does it not make that much of a difference?
No, it doesn't make that much of a difference, because if you have a tree that's on fire, like we'll say like an oak tree, if you have an oak tree that's on fire, that's putting off so much more heat than what like a thing of plastic could. And that tree is going to burn for a lot longer. And so I'm not sure how much they've shown it on the news, but a lot of what wildland firefighting is called mopping up. And it's we go and excuse me, we go and like open up branches or cut down logs or open up logs, because if you have like that wind and the sunshine that comes in, it can reignite. Um, so plastic is just going to burn and melt and not really affect it all that much.
Interesting. Okay. Okay, because in my head, I assumed that houses are becoming more and more flammable, but
I
if
mean, well, and so that's also part of the reason why in the West, especially, they have a lot more discussion about fire prevention and like the WUI, because WUI is, hey, you need to clear the branches away from your house, or you need to keep like flammable products away from your house. Or there was a video of a house that basically the head of the fire came right towards them and was surrounding them, but they have a like a sprinkler system that like douses the house with water. And so that's what kept their house from being burned over.
You mentioned earlier about how, it's kind of crazy that we politicize this ecological issue. Um, who is usually responsible for this kind of forest management? Is that the federal government, or is it on the state level, or is it just individual
Um,
groups?
Again, it depends on where you're at. I have noticed that Texas and really east of Colorado is a great example of an unregulated market in terms of vegetation because Texas, and this is the information I know from research, is 90 plus percent privately owned. And so that's ranchers or farmers or like houses, developments, whatever. It's privately owned. And so they're the ones that are supposed to be responsible for managing their land. But then you have the rest of the like 10 less percent that's for Texas, it would be like Parks and Wildlife or um, we have engines or people come in from like Bureau of Land Management or Forest Service, and then like A&M has a Forest Service um, branch up there, and so our scope of control for that is much smaller for land management, which is why it's a lot more difficult to manage the land because the people that are trying to manage it are competing with nature and then the nature that's surrounding them, which is probably like privately owned, like a person that owns a ranch.
Can you go into detail a little more about that? What you mean by them competing with nature?
For like invasive species, the like the Yopon, if you have if you have an area, and I'll use the Nature Conservancy specifically, because I worked and did some of this. If you have like a species that has become invasive and you're now trying to conserve and get the area back to where it's supposed to be ecologically, you have like you clear out the area, you turn it back into a grasslands. But you also have the competition around you for like root growth for trees or like invasive species or like invasive seeds blowing into your property that suddenly start to germinate. And so it's constantly like a losing battle in some ways where you take one step forward and then sometimes take two or three steps back because you're trying to manage your own land, but then you also have the outside land that is affecting or altering or changing what you've already done.
Okay, and now I know you touched on this a little bit earlier. What is different about how the Native Americans manage the land versus how we do it? Is it that privatization?
Um, Honestly, I think it is them understanding the land and having um, the knowledge and the education and passing on that education. Um, because like just seeing fire as like a destructive force is super counterproductive because then you're going to say, like we did in the 1900s when we started the Forest Service, only suppression tactics instead of we need to use fire as a tool instead of seeing it as a hindrance. And they
How would
use it as
one
a
use it
tool,
as a tool?
like controlled burning.
And that, can you repeat what that does again? Like I know it's like a controlled area being
Um,
burned, but how is that creative as opposed to destructive?
Well, and so like I said, whenever the plant burns, it's completed its cycle. And so those nutrients go back into the ground. And so essentially you're always going to have invasive species. And that's why I use the Yopon holly as the example, because it's a native, but it's invasive. And so every, I think we're supposed to burn every like 1 to 4 years in the area that we live specifically. Um, and so it burns and it cycles and it doesn't allow that much growth as opposed to not burning. And then you have like 50 years of growth.
And so these kinds of controlled burns, are they not being taken advantage of in this day and age? Like, is that why we're seeing so many areas on the Pacific coast and up near Canada burning so rampantly?
Well, and that's the problem with the suppression only mentality and seeing fire as a hindrance or as a just only destructive force. Um, but really, it's not much different than water or rain. Like floods happen and they devastate areas, but it's also life-giving. And the same goes for fire. It can run through and destroy. That's not to say that we won't ever have wildfires again. It's the quote that I love is good fires prevent bad fires. Because if you are using fire frequently and maintaining and managing those fuels, then you don't have to worry about the buildup and then things like Hawaii and Amarillo and like 30 or 40 years ago, not even a 10,000 acre fire was huge. Now we don't even look twice at a 10,000 acre fire. Like we do
So,
millions of acres of fires now because we have so much, and it's like it's the correlation versus causation. Like if we let the fuel grow, then we're going to have more potential for burning.
got it, got it. So, is there ever any time that you look at the news and you're like, that you see like a big forest fire and you're like, oh, that's not so bad. That's actually a good thing.
Um, Typically on the news, no, because the news isn't going to report something that isn't bad. But there is a lot of like reductive sensationalism. And an example, the fires that happened in New Mexico 2 years ago, the that state's biggest fires. Shortly after that happened, it happened because it was a controlled burn that escaped from the Forest Service. After that happened, I believe it was the mayor came out and said we can no longer do burns on red flag days, and like that was basically the headline. And or no, the headline was essentially that we're not going to do prescribed burns anymore. But once you go in and read the text was we're not going to do prescribed burns on red flag days, which we already don't do prescribed burns on red flag days typically.
What's a red flag day
It's
for?
whenever you have an increased chance of fire probability. So you have like higher winds, um, you have low or higher temperatures, lower relative humidity, low fuel moisture. Like if you have drought-like conditions where the fuel's been super dry, um, basically what the Palisade fire has been for the last few days. You have really high winds, you have really dry fuel, um, low humidity, high temperatures. Like around this time, I think they're supposed to be expecting a lot of rain, and they haven't had rain in a long time. And that's when you get into
Wasn't
like the 1,000 100 hour fuel.
wasn't
Uh,
it earlier in 2024? Wasn't LA flooding or something?
they were, yeah.
Is that not enough?
No, because it's over a longer period of time.
Okay.
And again, that kind of goes into like the 1,000 hour, 100 hour, whatever fuel model uh, for for fuel moisture. Because if you have a tree it's the same for drying as it is for soaking up water. It's like a plank of wood. So like if you put a piece of wood on the ground and put water in it, depending on the size of the wood, it's going to soak up a bunch of water, and then it's going to take a long time for it to dry back out. But it's going to need a lot of water to soak up all that water. And so that's kind of what they have as well.
Got it. Got it. That's super interesting. I don't know a whole lot about fire. Like, how quickly do they usually spread from your experience?
It honestly depends. Grass fires are incredibly intimidating, but they also don't really do a whole lot in terms of how much heat and damage they put out because it's like pouring a few drops of gasoline versus like a barrel of gasoline. Um, I think the fastest that I've heard of a grass fire um, burning is like 1 to 3 acres a second, and
Crazy.
that's like really receptive fuels and really high winds and really like dry fuels. Like all conditions are good for that to be fire receptive, and it's going.
Are grass
Um,
fires like the fastest type
yeah,
of fire?
yeah.
Okay. 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 How
Um,
fast do you think this Palisades fire spread?
Honestly, I was trying to do some of the calculations because in some of my advanced fire behavior class, they gave us a bunch of spreadsheets on how to calculate like the fire growth and like the flame head and rate of spread and fuel density and stuff like that. I couldn't really find a lot of the inputs that I would need, but some of the ones that I did find, because like slope and angle and wind speed and like fuel density all kind of are more simple variables that are calculated. But
What would slope be, or slope and angle be in this? Are you referring to like a line graph of some sort?
no, for like elevation, like mountains.
Oh, okay, okay.
Yeah, that's another thing that we have to know about because fire moves faster uphill. It's preheating the fuel as it rises, and then it goes slower downhill. And so it kind
Mm.
of depends on which way it was going and what time of the day it was going, because the heat of the sun, depending on where like the aspects that it's facing, the northeast or southeastern aspect faces the sun longer, so it heats up faster, and the northwest sees less of the sun because of shadows, so you typically have more green fuel over there. Anyway, but some of the things that I did put in, I got, I think, like 57 kilometers per hour, which is,
That's really fast.
yeah, and like
Is
that's,
that square kilometers?
no, that's not.
Okay.
Um, and that's just shrubs, or that is shrubs, which isn't as fast as like a grass fire. That is about 36 miles an hour.
Wow. Oh, that's very fast and very dangerous.
Yeah.
Faster than I can run. What
Same.
what would you say, like for the people who are living in LA, when would you say would be the right time to evacuate?
There, there really isn't, I don't know, fire is so unpredictable. If you've seen the movie Only the Brave, are you familiar with that?
That's not that Angelina Jolie one, is it?
No, it's the one with Miles Teller and Josh Brolin. It's about the wildland firefighters.
No, I didn't see it.
So it's about a fire, the Yarnell fire in Arizona, and some hot shots that worked that fire. There's some controversy around it. It's not really relevant to the movie. That's actually a pretty accurate, closely accurate depiction of wildland firefighting. And so that's definitely a good resource if you're interested. But with that, um, they all ended up um, passing because of the fire. They went into an area to help try and save some people. And basically, there was a shift in the winds, and so it pushed the fire coming at them a lot faster than what they anticipated. And so it all kind of depends on the variables, what they're doing, where they're at, and then like what you expect, but it's always subject to change. Like every morning, whenever we do wildland firefighting, we have a like a weather report, and so we talk about what's going to happen for that day, like what the wind speeds are at each levels of wind, and then when wind shifts are supposed to happen. Like say a wind shift is supposed to happen from the like from the southwest to now opposites. And so if you're on a fire and you know about what time that's supposed to happen, that's something that you need to be aware of because it can get bad very fast. Um, that said, for houses and evacuations, it's a lot harder to predict um, because there's so many more variables. I mean, obviously with flooding, it's a little bit different, but with fire, you have a lot more possibilities of like the fire changing direction and coming at you. Um, so that's also kind of why they harp on like the WUI, like make sure that you are trimming trees around your houses and make sure that you're setting up like defensible areas around like creating fire breaks around your house so that you don't have or so that you lessen your possibility of that happening.
Okay, and what kind of fire breaks are normal to put around houses? Like, do you mean like just not having grass up front? Because I know there are areas of LA that don't have grass.
Yeah, and so that's also why it's a little bit more difficult for that situation because a lot of those fires probably happened from like the canopy fires, throwing a bunch of sparks and starting fires that way. And then once you have one house that kind of starts, then it acts just like the forest and it just keeps moving. But yeah,
Interesting.
like I was saying with the leaf blowers, like that's how like you're just creating a defensible space. And if that's like mowing the grass or like trimming trees or bringing like anything flammable inside, like not leaving grass clippings out, stuff like that. Um, but that's all stuff that like we plan for hurricanes, they are inundated with like wildfire stuff. Like don't drag chains, don't throw out cigarette butts because it's a lot more likely to happen there than it is here.
Now, how does it work where, I'm not too familiar with Southern California geography, but, you would think that if you had a wildfire one year, like it would take a long time for there to be enough fuel to rebuild in that area, would there not?
Not necessarily. Um,
Okay.
I mean, you can have what we call burn scars, and that's where you can tell where there's obviously been a burn because there's either a decrease of vegetation or the vegetation there is different based off of like the cheatgrass. And cheatgrass is a great example because that can grow back. Like that's been adapted and depends on fire to reproduce. So it stores the nutrients in its roots and then it grows back because that's what it wants to do. That's how it survives. And so that grows back every season. And if there's a lot more rain, it's going to grow back a lot more. And that's I knew that we were going to have a really bad fire year this year because last winter, they had a really wet lot of a lot of snow, not necessarily there, but like in Nevada where I was, they had a lot of snow, they had a lot of spring rains, and then it didn't really give it enough time to dry out and potentially burn. And so you have fuel from this season that got really big into the next season to grow more and got even bigger.
Okay. So what would you say is what would your prediction be for this year? You said this is going to be like a particularly dangerous year for wildfires, huh? But like
Well,
what
so
what areas would you say?
this past summer, 24, I knew that that was going to be busier. This summer, I haven't really kept track of what they had. But I think that they didn't have as much um, winter or spring precipitation, and so they didn't have a ton of growth. But you also have to account for how much growth was there already. And then now, if you don't have as much precipitation, then you have plants that are given more time to die and then have drought-like conditions. And that's why the balance of management is more important because um, if you're getting rid of that fuel before it has a chance to dry out and burn, then you're limiting or decreasing your potential for it to burn uh, as a wildfire as opposed to burning as a controlled burn or prescribed burn.
So your job there is obviously very dangerous. For people who want to get involved, how would you recommend they do that?
You mean like being wild in firefighters or just involved in general?
Being wild and firefighters, and like, if you don't want to do that, what other ways are there to be involved?
So there's actually kind of a mass exodus of wildland firefighters right now. Um, the infrastructure package that Biden passed last year was kind of like a holdover for pay increases.
What does
Because
that
the
mean?
first year that I started wildland firefighting was the first year that they started a $15 an hour minimum for like an entry level wildland firefighter. Um, because we don't make a whole lot. The way that we make our money is through overtime. Like the last season that I worked, I think I worked like 715 hours of overtime. And that's how you make your money. And that's not even a lot. Like hot shots, they average anywhere from like 1,000 to 1,200 hours of overtime in a season. That's
Who are
like five
they?
or 6 months.
Who are they? Hot
Hot
shots?
shots are like kind of like they are the ones that are called to go to different areas, and they'll do a lot of the setup of like we're gonna go in and cut some line, cut down trees, and then like engines or regular hand crews come in and do a lot of the mop up. And so they go all over the country to places that need places, but they're one of they're kind of like the rangers of the army. Um, they go in pretty fast and then do a lot of quick work and then move on to the next place.
Gotcha, gotcha. So, I mean, even if let's say pay wasn't an option, how do people get involved? Is there like a website or
So you can apply anywhere. USAjobs.gov is where you typically go. The application process has already kind of stopped. I think they might be flying some new openings in the next month for like last minute openings. But you go on usajobs.gov and look up like forestry technician because we're called forestry technicians instead of wildland firefighters. That was one of the things that we were trying to push for. But you look up forestry technician, you have to be able to um, pass the arduous pack test, which is where you have a 45-pound weighted vest and you have to walk 3 miles in 45 minutes. And that's kind of just to say that you are physically fit enough to be able to do that. And you do that every year. And then you do like a physical and stuff like that. But there are lots of places that are hiring, and you can typically get in um, anywhere. I mean, all over the country are looking for wildland firefighters. Outside of that, um, I mean, there's like prescribed burn associations. So if you want to get involved with trying to do prescribed burning, there's lots of like the Nature Conservancy has a lot of prescribed burn associations around the country. Um, there's educational resources through the Nature Conservancy. They're one of the biggest proponents for getting information, like good information out. You can volunteer with like a sanctuary or a nature preserve, or um, I know like Armand Bayou has like volunteer days where you can go and um, like plant native plants or um, cut down invasive species or um, there's lots of different things that you can do, and even just like creating a defensible space for where you live is helpful, um, because if you are helping to prevent a fire from your house to spread to another one, or catching a fire at your house and spreading on, that's leaps and bounds better than what it could be.
What are some ways that you can make your house more fire resistant? Like other
Um,
than like more specifically than creating a fire barrier
I
or
mean,
a
really,
burn barrier.
that's what we that's what we preach a lot is like mowing around your place, keeping like pretty much anything that's flammable, keep it away from your place. Like, excuse me, keeping it away during certain times of the month, keeping track of red flag warnings, um, knowing when there's more of a possibility of a fire, not only happening, but also spreading. Um, like with the Santa Ana winds, making sure that you don't have dried grasses or shrubs or whatever that could blow away. Um, I mean, it's all kind of like generalized, but just creating that space is super helpful.
Now, we talked a little bit earlier about how the local government mismanaged the amount of water that was being used. I think they had like a reservoir that was completely empty when, that was part of their preparation. Is there any kind of equipment or anything that people say here in Houston could donate to people in California that could help them out? Or is this the kind of thing that it just has to take its
Um,
course?
so I mean, tanker trucks for the suppression aspect, tanker trucks are some of the things that we request for resources to go out to different areas, and it's basically just a truck full of water that you can hook a pump up to and either use it on the ground or fill up an inflatable thing for a helicopter to scoop up some water. Um, but those are really a lot of what we use is like retardant lines. Like they'll fill up a plane with like fire retardant and they'll put a line down to keep the fire from spreading. Or I don't know if you've seen the helicopters dropping a bucket of water. They'll either get that from like a lake or like a pond or like a swimming pool. I've honestly seen them pull from a swimming pool before, and it's really anywhere that you can get the water from.
So it's just standard fresh water that they're using
Yeah.
a lot of the time, right? Okay.
Yep.
Okay. That's super interesting. Um, yeah, that's I learned a lot from you today.
I mean, honestly, like that's kind of just one of the like the tip of the iceberg because there's so many more variables once you get deeper into it. Like one of the things that I learned about for my class was like rate of spread or fire line intensity or chemistry of fuels and combustion and fire emissions. And like I've created a smoke management plan for like a prescribed burn to anticipate where the smoke is going to go and like when the best time to have a prescribed burn is based on like the smoke anticipation. It's very very as in depth as you want it to be, and that's one of the things that I enjoy and appreciate about it. But also wish that we knew more about it as a collective, because there's so many things to learn about the fire sciences, but the fire sciences are honestly pretty groundbreaking at this point. Like
Yeah,
we're entering very uncharted territory that a lot of people don't know about.
that's one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you today. It's just, talking to you in person, I was like, man, I don't know most of the stuff he's talking about. And I feel like a lot of people could benefit from just a drop of the knowledge that you have to offer. Like, for example, you were talking about smoke management. What kind of damage can be done by just like being near the smoke or just
I
being in the
mean,
area?
lots of things. It also depends on what's burning, like whether that's plants or like plastic. You have different toxins that you like. I could send you the different chemicals and the different like let's see. Yeah, like the different emissions and the different chemical composition of the smoke. I mean, really, it's gonna be short-term irritation to like your eyes, throat, lungs, nose. Um, Long-term, it's gonna potentially lead to cancers because you have a lot of irritants, a lot of pollutants that you are exposed to. Um, it depends on where you're at and what's burning, because like the Yopon burning is different than just like grass burning. And then also depending on the activity of the atmosphere, determines whether the smoke is going to be down on the ground or if it's going to go up and out. Um, so
Would it, I assume this is like bad for the ozone layer.
Well, and so that's the other thing. If you have more controlled burns, prescribed burns, the smoke, like the nutrients, the carbon, the nitrogen, the oxygen, those are going into the ground, as opposed to if you have these big wildfires, those are now being sent up into the atmosphere. And so that's contributing more, it's amplifying and expediting the climate change process because we're only doing the suppression tactics.
What's the difference in terms of where the chemicals are going? Is that just the size of the fire?
Um, for the most part, yeah. I mean, it's like I said, like burning like 2 or 3 gallons of gas um, slowly over time versus throwing 5 or 6 gallons onto a fire.
Okay, okay. And before we go, what would you say are should our friends in LA, what should they be most concerned about right now? Like, where should their priorities lie? And I'm not saying from like a government aspect, but rather for
Yeah.
like the locals who are living there. Like,
I mean, honestly, their priority should lie with making sure that they're safe immediately, um, watching out for each other. Um, it's it's incredibly chaotic being in a situation like that. And I imagine it's going to be a lot more common in the future. But just remembering that the people around you are also kind of going through the same thing. And so it's like the love your neighbor, like the compassion. Um, and I've seen so much anger and just hate directed towards them just because of where the fire is at. But I mean, honestly, a lot of that is more of the government and not necessarily the people that are going through it. Just because they lost their houses and they have millions of dollars doesn't mean that they haven't lost everything that they own. Um, so longer term, probably look more into like the policies and procedures and like the insurance thing is a huge concern right now because of that. It's an awful traumatic experience to go through for anyone. And so just making sure that you and your family are safe and nothing happens, taking care of each other. It's really all that I can say. Be mindful,
Any
keep an
sort
eye out.
of health issues they should be concerned about?
Um, I mean, there aren't going to be a ton of like immediate health issues that you wouldn't attribute just to smoke, because smoke inhalation is going to be really the most immediate, unless you have like a burn or something like that. Because if you inhale pollutants, that's not going to pop up until later.
What about for pets?
I don't actually know a whole lot about, um, excuse me. I mean, I guess try to find, I know that there are lots of areas where they're taking in like emergency shelters for pets and animals, like emergency vets. If you feel that that's the case, that that's what you need to do, then by all means, do what you feel is best for you and your family. One thing that I will say, there's a common misconception that we were kind of fed by the media of if you take like a wet rag and put it over your mouth, it's easier for you to breathe, but that's actually not true. It actually, because the moisture, it helps trap some of that heat, and so you're breathing in more heat than what you would be if it were just like a handkerchief that was dry.
Okay, no, that's great information. I would not have known that. I would definitely be the guy putting water on a
And
towel and breathing
yeah,
through that.
that's something that we were taught, but yeah, and depending on how close to the fire you are, it can burn your throat and your lungs, like second, third degree burns, depending on how much you're breathing in.
Any other misconceptions that we may have been fed? Stop, drop, and roll. Is that a real thing?
I mean, yeah, you should probably. One of the things that we're taught is like finding a place that, like, if you have a fire coming at you, find a place like rocks or road or like any natural barrier to put between you and a fire that's coming at you, or like like if a fire is coming at you, get on like something to keep yourself safe, something that's not going to burn, and that's going to increase your chances depending on how much heat is put off, at least a little bit.
Okay, so you said go on something
Yeah,
at a stove.
a pile of rocks, like something that doesn't have fuel that can burn, or like a road is one of the things that we're taught to, like a gravel or asphalt road or a dirt road even, because you have that, it's a fire break. You have a natural or man-made area that isn't going to burn and the fire is going to stop
Got
or
it.
go
Got
around you.
it. Understood. Well, Brandon, thank you so much for all your help today. I know we've been wanting to talk about this stuff for a while, and it just so happens that it is very urgent that this information gets out.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah, thank you so much for what you do as well. Thank you for helping us be educated on this subject, and
Of course. Yeah.
thank you for your service.
Yeah. Thank you. Glad to be here. Glad to inform.
All right, we appreciate it.